The moment I watched Howard collapse after drinking from my glass, a cold satisfaction settled in my bones that I'd never felt before. I hadn't expected the simple act of switching drinks with my father-in-law would expose decades of poisonous family manipulation, or that my mother-in-law's trembling hands had been attempting murder all along. My name is Ryan Sawyer. I never thought I'd be the type to get caught up in family drama like something out of a soap opera, but life is a funny way of dragging you into the mud when you least expect it. Growing up in Nashville, I'd always been the kid with a camera in his hands. My parents weren't wealthy, but they supported my passion, scraping together enough for my first real camera when I turned 16. I spent countless hours in the Blue Ridge Mountains, capturing everything from misty sunrises to black bears ambling through rhododendron thickets. Photography wasn't just a hobby, it was my escape, my therapy, my voice. By 26, I'd built a modest but growing business. Wedding shoots paid the bills, while my wildlife portfolio slowly gained recognition in local galleries. That's when I met Melanie Griffin at one of my exhibitions, stunning, intelligent, and laughing at my terrible jokes. She worked as a pediatric nurse, and something about the way her eyes lit up when she talked about helping kids made my heart skip. What I didn't realize was that loving Melanie meant inheriting her parents. Barbara and Howard Griffin lived in a sprawling Tudor-style home in Biltmore Forest, old money, old connections, and old ideas about who their daughter should marry. And I wasn't it. Photography? Howard scoffed during our first dinner together, swirling inexpensive scotch in a crystal tumbler. Interesting, hobby, but what's your actual career plan, son? The way he emphasized son made it clear I was anything but family. I still remember Melanie squeezing my hand under the table as I explained my business growth projections. Howard's eyes had glazed over, dismissing me before I'd even finished speaking. Well, Barbara chimed in, her smile never reaching her eyes. At least it's creative, though Melanie's ex-fiancé Christopher is doing remarkably well at his surgical practice now, just bought a vacation home in Kiowa, I hear. Christopher. The golden boy who got away. The doctor who checked all the Griffin family boxes until he mysteriously broke things off with Melanie 3 years before we met. I'd learned the truth about that situation much later. Despite their thinly veiled disapproval, Melanie and I married in a small ceremony at the Botanical Gardens. Howard and Barbara had pushed for a lavish country club affair, but for once, Melanie stood her ground. I caught Barbara dabbing at dry eyes during the ceremony, her performance as hollow as her congratulations. For 6 years, I endured this subtle sabotage. Howard questioning my finances at every turn, offering investment advice that always circled back to how I wasn't providing adequately. Barbara orchestrating awkward run-ins with Christopher or forwarding job postings to Melanie that would take her to cities far from me. They're just old-fashioned, Melanie would say, exhaustion in her voice. They'll come around. But they didn't. Instead, their behavior escalated. The breaking point came last month, at our dining room table, when Barbara handed me that special drink with trembling hands, her eyes darting away too quickly. I'd seen that look before on the faces of subjects trying to hide something from my camera lens. What I couldn't have imagined was how one simple act of self-preservation would unravel years of their toxic manipulation, exposing secrets that would forever change our family dynamic. I sat at the dining table, watching Barbara's hands tremble slightly as she set the whiskey in front of me. 6 years of marriage to Melanie had taught me to recognize the subtle tells of Griffin family manipulation. This wasn't ordinary nervousness, this was guilt. A special drink for my son-in-law, Barbara announced with that hollow smile I'd grown to despise. Howard's premium scotch for the gallery opening tomorrow. Her eyes darted away too quickly. The gallery opening. My big break of feature exhibition at Asheville's most prestigious art space, with collectors and critics flying in from Atlanta and Charlotte. Barbara knew exactly how important this was to me. How thoughtful, I said, not touching the glass. Though I'm surprised, you've never been much of a supporter of my little hobby, as Howard calls it. Howard chuckled from across the table. Come now, Ryan, family disagreements aside, we can celebrate your achievements. The pause before achievement spoke volumes. I glanced at Melanie, caught her worried expression. She'd been unusually quiet tonight, withdrawn. Something was off. Actually, I said, standing suddenly, Howard, you should have the first taste. It's your scotch, after all. Before anyone could object, I switched our glasses, sliding his water toward me and my whiskey toward him. The flash of panic across Barbara's face confirmed everything. I prepared that specially for Ryan, Barbara stammered. Howard can't. Howard, oblivious and arrogant as ever, raised the glass with a dismissive wave. Nonsense, Barbara, if the boy doesn't appreciate good scotch, I'm happy to demonstrate proper appreciation. He took a substantial swallow before Barbara could stop him. What followed was chaos. Within 20 minutes, Howard was violently ill, slurring his words before collapsing into his dinner plate. The ambulance came and went, leaving Melanie and me alone in the aftermath. He knew, Melanie whispered, handshaking as she clutched a mug of tea. How did you know? The way she couldn't look me in the eye, 6 years of the game's mouth, I've learned to watch for the signs. I ran my hands through my hair, the cold anger crystallizing inside me. But drugging me to make me miss tomorrow's opening, that's crossing a line even for them. 3 days later, the hospital toxicology report confirmed what I'd suspected, benzodiazepines. Enough to ensure I'd have been unconscious through my career-defining moment. They would have told everyone I was an alcoholic, I said, showing Melanie the report. That I couldn't handle the pressure, that I was unreliable, that you deserved better. Something broke inside Melanie that day. I watched her face transform as years of denial crumbled. Christopher, she whispered, realization dawning. My God, Ryan, they did this to Christopher too. Christopher. The Golden Boy surgeon who'd mysteriously broken their engagement after showing up drunk to a charity gala. The man who'd allegedly developed a drinking problem and anger issues right as their wedding approached. I need to call him, Melanie said, voice stronger than I'd heard in years. The conversation with Christopher revealed everything. The accidents before important career events. How he'd wake up disoriented, missing appointments. The concerned suggestions from Barbara that he seek treatment for his developing addiction. They didn't want him either. I asked Melanie after she hung up. No, they wanted him broken first, dependent, someone they could control. Tears streamed down her face. Christopher fought back. When he threatened to expose them, they turned me against him with lies. That night, I held Melanie as she sobbed, years of manipulation unraveling in her mind. But as she fell into exhausted sleep, I remained awake, something cold and determined taking root inside me. They've done this before, I whispered to myself in the darkness. And they'll do it again unless someone stops them. The next morning, I called my lawyer and then a private investigator. I retrieved samples of the remaining scotch for independent testing. I installed hidden cameras in our home for the next Griffin visit. I began gathering evidence methodically, with the same patience I used to photograph elusive wildlife. Howard recovered within days. The incident explained away as food poisoning. Barbara sent flowers to my gallery opening with a note expressing her disappointment at Howard's absence due to his unfortunate illness. But something had changed. In switching those glasses, I'd done more than avoid being drugged, I'd switched the power dynamic itself. The predators had become the prey, and they didn't even know it yet. As I developed my photos in the darkroom that week, watching images emerge from blank paper, I realized that's exactly what I was doing with the Griffins. Bringing their true nature into the light, one careful exposure at a time. I waited 3 months before making my move, gathering evidence like a hunter stalking dangerous prey. Every conversation recorded, every accidental slip-up from Barbara documented, every financial transaction Howard had used to control Melanie's life carefully catalogued. The weight of the manila folder in my hands felt like a weapon as I rang the doorbell to the Griffin estate. Ryan, what a surprise! Barbara's voice dripped with false warmth as she opened the door. Melanie didn't mention you were coming for dinner. She doesn't know I'm here, I replied, my voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath my skin. But we need to talk, all of us. Howard appeared in the hallway, bourbon in hand. This better be important, boy. The Hendersons are coming in an hour. Oh, it's important, I said, walking past them into their pristine living room. Important enough to cancel your dinner plans. I set up my laptop on their coffee table, hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Barbara perched nervously on the edge of the sofa while Howard remained standing, looming over me like he'd done countless times before. 3 weeks ago, I installed security cameras in your house. I began, clicking play on the first video file. The color drained from Barbara's face as her own voice filled the room. Once the exhibition fails, we can suggest he seek help. Melanie will finally see he's holding her back. Howard lunged for the laptop. You had no right. Sit down, I commanded with such quiet authority that he actually complied. I'm not finished. I play recording after recording. Their plans to sabotage my career. Their discussions about which of Melanie's friends needed to be managed out of her life. Barbara's calculated suggestions about how to make me appear unstable. And here's my personal favorite, I said, clicking on the final video. The night after Howard drank his own poisoned scotch. The footage showed them in this very room, Barbara pacing frantically while Howard raged about my disrespect. We need to accelerate the plan, recorded Howard snarled. I want him gone by summer. Melanie belongs here with her family, not with that photographer. The silence that followed was deafening. Barbara's hands trembled worse than they had the night she'd handed me that fateful drink. Christopher Thornton sends his regards, I said softly, pulling out a written statement from Melanie's ex-fiancé detailing identical tactics. As G. Jesse Williams and Taylor Brennan, Melanie's college friends, you drove away. Interesting how similar their stories are. This is absurd, Howard finally sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction. You've manipulated these recordings. Like you manipulated Melanie's entire life. I cut him off. I have originals, timestamps, and witnesses. Everything has been copied to my lawyer. The doorbell rang, startling Barbara so badly she knocked over a crystal vase. That would be Melanie, I said, checking my watch. Right on time. When she entered, the tension in the room was thick enough to photograph. Her eyes moved from her parents' ashen faces to my open laptop, understanding dawning immediately. "You showed them," she whispered. "Everything," I confirmed. Howard's demeanor suddenly shifted, his businessman instincts taking over. "Ryan, perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot all these years. You've shown initiative, backbone, the kind of qualities I value in my firm. There is an opening in our investment division." A laugh escaped me, hollow and cold. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't a negotiation." I closed my laptop and turned to Melanie, whose eyes shone with unshed tears and something else bright. "Should we tell them now?" she asked. I nodded, taking her hand. Melanie faced her parents, shoulder straight, voice unwavering. "I'm pregnant. You are going to be grandparents in 6 months." Her hand tightened around mine. "And you have a choice to make. You can be part of this child's life on our terms with respect and boundaries, or you can continue your gains and never meet your grandchild at all." Barbara collapsed onto the sofa, a strangled sound escaping her throat. Howard stood frozen, for once entirely speechless, as the reality sank in that the ultimate control had slipped forever from his grasp. In the devastating silence that followed, I felt something shift inside me, not just anger or vindication, but a profound sense of freedom. The predators had finally become the prey, trapped in a cage of their own making. I got up to leave, but Howard suddenly blocked my path, his eyes wild with a desperation I'd never seen before. "You think you're the first, don't you?" he hissed, his composure cracking like thin ice. "The first to stand up to us?" Something in his tone made my blood run cold. "Dad, stop it," Melanie warned, stepping between us. But Howard was beyond restraint. "Show him, Barbara." Barbara's face had gone completely white. "Howard, please." "Show him." Howard roared, making us all flinch. With trembling hands, Barbara retrieved a leather-bound ledger from a hidden compartment in the bookshelf. She placed it on the coffee table between us, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I opened it, and my world tilted sideways. Names. Dates. Photographs. Detailed notes spanning decades. Not just Melanie's relationships, but a meticulous record of every person who had threatened the Griffin family's control or reputation. Business rivals. Former friends. Even Howard's own brother. And beside several names, a small red X. "What is this?" I whispered, though a sickening realization was already dawning. "Insurance," Howard said flatly. "Everyone has secrets, Ryan. Everyone has weaknesses." My fingers stopped on a familiar name, Christopher Thornton. The margin note read, "Car accident arranged, now 2016, clean." I felt the room spin. Christopher hadn't just been driven away, he died in that accident 3 months after breaking his engagement with Melanie. "You killed him," I murmured, looking up at Howard with horror. "You killed Melanie's fiancé." Melanie snatched the book from my hands, her face ash-white as she flipped through pages of her parents' calculated destruction. When she found Christopher's entry, she made a sound I'll never forget, part scream, part sob. "It was necessary," Barbara whispered. "He discovered things about the family business, about Howard's associates. Things no one outside the family should know," Howard added, suddenly eerily calm. "Just like you have now." The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about social manipulation. The Griffins weren't just controlling parents, they were dangerous. Deadly. I glanced at Melanie, whose hand had moved protectively to her stomach, our unborn child. In that moment, I realized our clever revenge plan had unwittingly opened the door to something far darker than we'd imagined. The cameras, Howard said with chilling precision. "How many are there? Who else has seen the footage?" My lie about my lawyer having copies suddenly felt desperately inadequate. I hadn't anticipated needing real protection from actual killers. The doorbell rang again. Howard smiled thinly. "The Hendersons right on time." But when Barbara opened the door, it wasn't the Hendersons. "FBI," came a voice from the hallway. "Mr. and Mrs. Griffin, we have some questions about the disappearance of Christopher Thornton." The agent who stepped into the room nodded almost imperceptibly at me. My anonymous tip, sent just before I arrived, had found its mark. The silence after the FBI agents entered was deafening, like the moment before lightning strikes. Hal's face transformed before my eyes, the powerful patriarch crumbling into a cornered animal. Barbara collapsed onto the sofa, her perfectly manicured hands covering her mouth to stifle a scream that never came. I felt Melanie's fingers intertwine with mine, squeezing so hard it almost hurt. Her touch anchored me as the room exploded into chaos. "You set this up," Howard snarled at me, lunging forward before an agent restrained him. "You have no idea what you've done." I stood my ground, despite the tremor in my voice. "I know exactly what I've done. I stopped you." The next hours blurred together in a storm of statements, evidence collection, and the surreal image of the mighty Howard Griffin being led away in handcuffs, Barbara trailing behind like a ghost of herself. The leather-bound ledger, that damning catalogue of the sins, became exhibitor in what would eventually become the most shocking criminal case our town had ever seen. Later that night, as Melanie and I sat in our tiny apartment's kitchen, the magnitude of what we'd uncovered washed over us. I always knew they were controlling, she whispered, hands cradling her stomach, but I never imagined murder. Her voice broke on the word. All those people, Ryan, all those lives they ruined, Christopher. I remembered when I'd first met Melanie. She'd been a shell of a person, afraid of her own shadow, constantly seeking her parents' approval. The woman beside me, now Tia Street but resolute, was finally free. 6 months later, I stood in the back of the courtroom as the verdict was read. Howard received 25 years for Christopher's murder and a host of financial crimes the FBI had uncovered. Arbor, who had ultimately cooperated, still faced 15 years. The empire built on blackmail, intimidation, and blood money crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. Do you regret it? My father asked me over coffee the following morning. Getting involved with his family in the first place? I thought about it, watching the steam rise from my cup. I used to imagine a dozen ways I could have gotten revenge on them, I admitted. Humiliate them at their country club, expose their secrets to their social circle, but this. I shook my head. This wasn't revenge, this was justice. The night our daughter was born, we named her Hope. I held her tiny form against my chest and made her a promise. No one will ever control your life but you, I whispered into her downy hair. No one will ever make you feel small. 2 years later, I received a letter from Howard's prison. I considered burning it unopened, but something made me tear the envelope. I underestimated you, he'd written in shaky handwriting. I always saw you as beneath us, but in the end, you were simply beyond us, beyond our manipulation. You loved Melanie for who she was, not what she represented. That's something I never understood until I lost everything. I folded the letter and tucked it away. Not as a keepsake, but as a reminder of how easily power corrupts when wielded without conscience. Sometimes at night, I still wake in a cold sweat, remembering that red marked ledger and how close we came to becoming entries in it ourselves. But then I feel Melanie's warmth beside me, hear Hope's soft breathing from her room across the hall, and those fears dissolve into gratitude. The revenge I once craved would have made me more like Howard, calculating, manipulative, consumed by control. Instead, I found something Howard never had, peace. Not from defeating my enemies, but from refusing to let their darkness change who I was. The greatest victory wasn't watching the Griffins fall, it was building something beautiful from the ashes of their destruction. A family bound not by fear and manipulation, but by choice and love. That's a power no ledger, no fortune, no scheme could ever match. Looking back now, I realize what really broke Howard and Barbara's hold wasn't the confrontation or the evidence, it was my refusal to become them. They'd spent decades building walls of manipulation and control, never understanding that real power comes from letting go. Every time I watch Melanie laugh freely with our daughter, I see what her parents missed, that love multiplies when given without strings attached. The poison in that glass could have turned me bitter, could have made me obsess over payback. Instead, it became the catalyst for something far more powerful, authenticity. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and Eliza sleeps peacefully down the hall, I think about Howard's face when he finally understood he lost. Not because I'd outmaneuvered him, but because I'd chosen a different path entirely. They never knew, I whispered to myself in those moments, that the greatest revenge against control is simply to live freely, and that's something they can never take from us.